is that the plants aren't demanding as much calcium in their growth, because calcium is necessary for the new growth. And you see, if the plants aren't growing much anymore, there's probably still enough calcium available, and so there's no problem. So you won't see this late in the growing season. Uneven watering. This is a lily stem. Can you see that? How wide open it's split? I'm a hand waterer. I have a sandy soil, which is unusual, and I tend to be a low-level waterer, and yet I give the plants enough to keep them alive. But very obviously, somebody stopped and talked to me while I was watering that lily plant, and lo and behold, I put too much water on. The stem took it up. The outside of the stem can expand, the inside can, and it split right open. Very interesting, but it happens lots of times. You ever have this happen on tomatoes? You see, once the tomato fruit is set, the external portion can no longer expand. The internal parts can, and so if you give that plant a lot of water when it's already set, the outer portion is going to split. Same thing true with cherries. It virtually always rains during the time when we have cherries on. I read something interesting recently. They used to think this was due to water picked up from the soil, but now they say it can even be water that lands on the fruit from the rain. But they find that if they sprinkle the plants with a calcium salt prior to the rain, that they can reduce the splitting clear down to about 1/3 of what it would if they didn't do that. So they're working on this to control it. Vegetative parts of the plant, of course, can do it. And when I showed you the lily stem, here are carrots that were already set, ready to go, and somebody gave it a bunch of water, and they split wide open. Here's a biological control. If you plant your carrots close enough together, one will wrap around the other one, and it will prevent it from splitting quite as bad. Of course, I'm just kidding. So much for non-infectious diseases where there's necrosis. Now we're going to start talking about some diseases where there are causal organisms. If we stop and think a little bit about disease-producing organisms that affect the foliage of plants, we need to realize that in this area of the country, we don't have many disease-producing organisms that affect the foliage. Now, don't say we don't have any, but we don't have many, and the reason for it is that most of these disease-producing organisms have to have condensed moisture for a period of 6, 8, 10, 12 hours in order for infection to take place. And during our dry summers, unless we overhead sprinkle, we don't have that situation, so we don't have many disease-producing organisms that affect the foliage. But we have a few. But my mother lived in the Midwest, and I used to go back and visit her, and I wandered around the neighbors' gardens, and I was just fascinated with all the diseases I could find, because they have rain every week or every 2 weeks back there, and just you don't have any problem finding diseases at all. Here you might have to look a little bit. Bacteria are very, very small organisms, one-celled organisms that you can hardly see with a light microscope. You can just barely see them. They are not very common causal agents in plant disease. There are maybe only 400, 500 of them that can cause plant disease. Several reasons for this, but the main one is, at least in this area, is that they are high-temperature organisms. They like high temperatures, and we have high temperatures, but it's during our dry period, so there's no problem. Now, there is a bacterium that goes to ivy and causes this leaf spot, and we only find this where people overhead sprinkle their ivy in the summertime. It's too cold in the wintertime when we have our rain, so there's no problem. But if you overhead sprinkle in the summertime, you'll have it. Bacterial leaf spots tend to be sort of angular. The bacteria are not capable of crossing main veins, and so you will see that they tend to be angular. This is a bacterium on lavender, and notice again they're round out in the middle, but when they come up against a vein, notice that they stop. Stop by veins. They do not cross the main veins. Here's a beautiful one on tomato. This is a a problem that we do see occasionally, because when people are producing tomatoes in their nurseries early in the season, sometimes they overhead sprinkle. And so we do see this occasionally. Again, notice that the spots are round out on the leaf, but when they come up against a vein, they are stopped and they become angular. This same bacterium also infects the fruits of tomatoes, and notice those spots are nice and round. How come? No veins on the fruits, you see, so we're going to get round spots. Here's a bacterial disease of walnuts. Can be a serious problem. Even on the fruits here, they tend to be somewhat angular, which is sort of interesting. A disease that you may see on acorns in this area is one in which we find an insect lays her eggs in the acorns. In the top row you can see little holes, and that's where she laid her eggs. But in the bottom ones you can see that the acorns are beginning to turn brown, being killed by the bacteria. And unfortunately, when this happens, they give off an exudate that's very sticky, and the disease is called drippy nut. And if you have a patio or a car or underneath these, you may be very upset with your oak trees, and you may want to do something about trying to prevent the fruits from being formed so that you don't have this problem. Moving on to leaf-infecting fungi. We have lots of leaf-infecting fungi here. Again, depending upon what type of plants you have, probably one of the more serious ones that you will run into is sycamore anthracnose. Sycamore anthracnose is common in this area. The fungus invades the tissues, and unlike most disease-producing organisms, it chooses the veins and moves right down the veins. And so if you see tissue being killed right down the veins on sycamore, you know that you have the sycamore anthracnose fungus. The sycamore anthracnose fungus, if it kills enough tissue down the vein, causes the abscission layer of that leaf to form, and so that leaf will drop. And so we have lots of leaf drop associated with sycamore anthracnose. Now, sycamore anthracnose is dependent upon rain. If we have late rains after the leaves come out in the spring of the year, we're almost bound to have sycamore anthracnose. And last year we had lots of late rains, and I never saw so much sycamore anthracnose. It really was very, very intense last year. Lots of leaf drop clear into the fall as a result of this fungus. Now, once the leaves are infected, and if they fall, they're no longer a problem. This fungus produces its spores in a sticky mucilaginous material, which means that it has to be water dispersed. It means that there's no way for water raindrop to hit an old leaf on the ground and splash the spores clear up into a sycamore tree, so don't worry about it, regardless of what you read. If you want to, you can rake those leaves up and put them in your compost pile. There's no problem with that. It's just very good. And I tell people, if they have lots of sycamore anthracnose, be glad you can have lots of compost this year, you see. The problem with this particular fungus is that it, in addition to infecting the leaves, it also infects the twigs. And if it infects the twigs, then it will carry over from one year to the next in those twigs. If we have any late rains after the new leaves come out, then the fungus is going to be splashed from those twigs onto the new leaves. If we have additional rains after that, then the fungus is going to be splashed from those new leaves onto the newer leaves. And this is what happened last year. We just kept infecting leaves clear up into May. Now, if your sycamore tree were small enough, you could control this by pruning out those branches. But most sycamore trees are too big to get up and prune the previous season's growth from all of the branches. And so we just have to learn to live with this. I mean, there's no fungicide that gives control for it, regardless of what you read. And you're not going to go and prune all those branches, so just learn to live with it. Accept the fact that you're going to. I've never seen sycamore anthracnose kill a tree. I've never seen it even come close to killing a tree. So you learn to live with it. And as I say, maybe when they named the tree, They named it correctly because it's sycamore than other trees. We have a similar fungus that goes to Modesto ash. Modesto ash, it does a similar thing. Kills the leaves, also invades the twigs. It carries over from one year to the next in the twigs. But the problem with this particular one, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that I've seen this fungus defoliate Modesto ash trees to the point where some big branches have died. They haven't died from infection, directly from infection, but they've died from lack of nutrients supplied by the leaves. And so this can be just a good reason for not growing that plant, okay? You don't have prejudices about plants, but I do. And I've already told you two, sycamore and Modesto ash. Evergreen elms also are infected by an anthracnose, a different one. These are all different fungi. And this one causes black spots on the leaves, black spots on the stems. We're not worried about the carrying over on the stems in this plant because the leaves are on all year long. It's an evergreen plant, and so during the winter months the fungus spreads considerably. So you may want to prune this, or you may decide that you don't want to grow evergreen elm, or if you do, you may want to grow the Drake cultivar. By the way, there is a sycamore cultivar that is resistant to this fungus if you want to grow it, if you insist on growing sycamores, and it's called Bloodgood. Bloodgood cultivar is resistant to it. The Drake cultivar is resistant in elms. We have some interesting leaf spots, I think, that are very, very beautiful. This is a fungus that you find on Rhaphiolopus. It's called Endomosporium leaf spot. A very beautiful little fungus. The spores look like little tiny insects. That's where it gets its name. This fungus goes to a number of members of the palm tribe of the rose family. Here it is on evergreen pear. You perhaps have seen it on evergreen pear. It causes a lot of defoliation. Really can be a serious problem on evergreen pear. And again, these plants you see are evergreens. They have their leaves on during the wintertime. Fungus produces its spores in a sticky mucilaginous substance. You're going to think that all fungi do, but they don't. We'll talk about some that don't in a minute. But these are spread around during the wintertime and splashed all over, and so it causes a lot of defoliation on evergreen pears. Some cultivars are more susceptible than others. Same fungus also goes to pyracantha, also goes to loquat. And so we have lots of plants that are susceptible to that fungus. Pretty difficult to control. This is called Heterosporium leaf spot. Fungus infects many, many different forms of iris. Produces these spots, typical of many fungus leaf spots. They are round, they cross the veins, and they sometimes have concentric zones in them. These are not exactly round, these are elliptical, but it has to do with the fact that we have parallel venation here, and so it causes the spots to be elliptical. This particular fungus, if you have it, can be controlled very easily by good cultural practices. At the end of the growing period in the, maybe July, August, when you dig up your iris to transplant them, you will find that most of the spots are on the older portions of the leaves. Now, the older portions of the leaves, because this is a monocotyledonous plant, are at the tip of the leaf. They grow from the bottom. So the new growth is down at the bottom. So when you transplant your irises, cut all that upper material off. That'll leave nice green leaves down at the bottom. Transplant your iris, and be sure you get rid of all of those leaves. Do not leave any of them laying behind, because this fungus can produce a secondary spore that goes through the winter and will start the whole cycle again the next year. So sanitation, good cultural practices, complete control, no problem whatsoever. The question is, don't compost those, and that's right, because that fungus, unless you use the rapid compost pile. If you use the rapid compost pile, fine. If you don't compost those. Put them in your garbage can and let somebody else worry about them. Here it is up near the tip, and sometimes it'll even kill the tips of the leaves. Can be pretty serious on occasion. Here's another Heterosporium leaf spot that I said didn't occur in California. Last year I was walking around And I guess maybe partly because of our rains, I began to see this in many areas. Another heterosporium, it's a different fungus than goes to iris. This one doesn't go to iris. The iris one doesn't go to this. But on nasturtiums, which again tend to perennate and be evergreen in this area, even though they're considered as annuals, you can have this fungus leaf spot on them. Another heterosporium, it's very common on members of the carnation family, the genus Dianthus. This happens to be Wee Willie, Sweet William, but every once in a while I'll see some nursery have this and they overhead sprinkle, and so they splash the fungus all around, though this fungus produces airborne spores. It doesn't have to be splashed, but because they overhead sprinkle, there's much condensed moisture on the leaves, and this allows the fungus to become established. A fungus that you may see on your ivy commonly is Phylosticta, an interesting fungus. Ivy is an evergreen, so during the winter months this is very common. It doesn't damage the plants a lot. In fact, I think it's sort of pretty. But, well, you know, after you work with things for a while, you get to see beauty in almost anything. So I think diseases are very nice, and I would be the first to say that it's probably a prejudice, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. Notice how that central spot crosses the main veins, like I told you fungus leaf spots do. Notice that it's concentric zones. The central tissue is dead, very characteristic of a fungus leaf spot. The interesting thing is, notice at the top of that leaf, there are two other spots, but they don't look like the one below. And we used to think this was all one fungus, Phylosticta. We've been checking it. We find that there are 5 different fungi that can produce spots in this. Now, I would say don't worry about trying to control it. In the summertime, the new growth is going to come up. It's going to hide all that winter growth. You're not going to see these beautiful spots. And unless you overhead sprinkle, if you overhead sprinkle, you may have the problem. But next winter, it'll start again, and you just enjoy it as part of the winter sequence of things that go on. Phylosticta oncala. Not too serious. Once in a while we see it. If I had a calla plant that had a few leaves like that, I'd cut those leaves off and just get rid of them. I wouldn't put them in my compost pile, but I would just get rid of them. Septoria, another fungus that produces its spores, a sticky mucilaginous material. And there are lots of different septorias. This one happens to go to Hebe. Hebe is very susceptible to this particular fungus. And if you want to see lots of septoria on Hebe, go to the San Francisco Zoo. They've used many, many species all through the zoo. And not only is it evergreen and have winter water, but they love to overhead sprinkle all of their shrubs in the summertime, so they spread this fungus all over. And every place you see Hebe in the San Francisco Zoo, you'll find this beautiful leaf spot. It's very interesting because notice how white the centers are. And this is characteristic of that particular fungus leaf spot on Hebe. Another septoria that you perhaps have seen, if you grow winter celery, you probably will see septoria leaf spot on it. Very, very common on it. Likes the winter rains, and I've never seen winter celery in our area that doesn't have some of this on it. It even can get down onto the stalks and make the stalks look pretty hideous. You might not even want to eat it. We don't have a good chemical control for it, so I would suggest that if you do grow celery in the wintertime, that as soon as you see any spots, you remove those leaves, get rid of them. And if this doesn't control it, then I would try to grow the celery in a different section of your garden, as far away from that section as possible. The fungus can't live in the soil, but it can live in old, dead celery refuse in the soil and carry over from one year to the next. So sanitation, again, would be a good way to control this. Botrytis. Botrytis we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute or so. Botrytis is a fungus which is very, very common, grows on lots of tissues, particularly dead herbaceous organic tissues. The fungus is incapable of gaining entrance into living tissues in most plants, but there is a form of botrytis that goes to lily, and it causes a serious disease like this. So if you see this, you know you probably have botrytis. A very similar form also goes to tulip, and in that particular plant they call the disease fire. We don't see it too often here, but in Northern California they see a lot of it. Both of these diseases are common, but you can see them on plants that are being grown around this area. We have some diseases, disease-producing organisms, in which the flowers are infected. This happens to be a camellia, and the disease is called camellia petal blight. Fungus infects only camellia flowers, nothing else. Once the fungus invades the tissues, it starts moving through the tissues. If you see tissues browning in the center part of the plant, the chances are pretty good that that's the camellia petal blight fungus. Sometimes you'll see tissues browning around the margin, and that can be old age, it can be frost, it can be excess water. A lot of things can cause that. But if you see them browning in the center and moving out, that's the camellia petal blight fungus. Fungus grows through the flower. It replaces the calyx, that green area around the base, with a hard fungus structure that falls to the ground, lives in the soil, doesn't live, it just exists, rests in the soil until the following spring. And the following spring or winter, the conditions that bring about the flowering of the camellia trigger that fungus to begin to develop, produces a little inverted mushroom that throws its spores into the air. Any that land on a flower in the presence of a drop of moisture germinate and start the whole cycle over again. A fantastic relationship between the fungus and the plant it attacks, and that's all that happens. And I'll show you those structures when we get to signs, because those are actually parts of the fungus that we're going to look at. Similar fungus goes to azaleas, rhododendrons. This one does cause a little more trouble because it produces a spore in the flowers which can be airborne or can be transmitted by bumblebees, which are pollinators of azaleas and rhododendrons. So this can have a secondary spread. Does the same thing, though, produces resting bodies that fall to the ground. The spring or the late winter, they germinate and infect the tissues and start this whole cycle over again. It also goes to more plants. Doesn't only go to azaleas, goes to rhododendrons, goes to other members of that particular family, and so it can cause a problem. Here you can see it starting in that rhododendron blossom. If you have that, any of these diseases, camellia petal blight, azalea petal blight, rhododendron, be sure that you remove the flowers. Do not let them fall to the ground, because if they do, they're going to produce their resting structures in the ground. Secondly, you have to do something other than just remove the flowers, because those little fruiting bodies, those little resting bodies, can remain in the soil for 3 to 5 years. So even if you start picking all the flowers, there's still going to be some in the soil that can cause the problem. If you don't want to use chemicals, you can put a 4-inch layer of mulch, any mulch down, and that will prevent those little fruiting bodies from reaching the surface of the soil, and you can break the cycle that way. Now, these methods are effective only in as much as you get good ground cover. If you miss a spot where that fungus, one of those little fruiting bodies can produce 1 million spores and can start the whole cycle again. Even more important is the fact that if you do all of this and your neighbor doesn't, those spores can blow in from his or her yard. So what this tells you is if everybody in your area is growing camellias, and if you're all interested in doing it, you make it a community project, and everybody do the same thing. That way you can break the cycle. We mentioned botrytis before. This particular botrytis is different from the one on the lily, but this one can only go in injured or inactive tissues. Flower tissues are inactive, and flowers are very susceptible. Botrytis is an airborne spore. It likes low temperature conditions. I don't know about down here, it's probably too warm, but in the Bay Area every summer we have 2 weeks in July where it's cool and moist, and the petunia flowers just melt. At that time I swear off petunia flowers. I say I'm not going to grow anymore, but after it dries off and they start blooming again, I become a petunia fancier again, because you get more mileage out of petunias than almost any other flower you can grow, and also they come in such a fantastic color range. So I still grow petunias, and I still have botrytis. Here it is on annual phlox. Notice that petunia flower down underneath. See how it's covered, and you see all that brown fluff? That's the fungus, and I'm sure you've seen it on any herbaceous dead material on the ground. In the summertime, if it's moist, it's just covered with spores. These are airborne spores. They blow around, and if they land on flowers in the presence of moisture, they will cause the problem. Here's what they do to gerbera. Move down into the flower head, and they just melt the stem. Now, interesting thing about this fungus is that it cannot infect healthy tissues directly, but if it has a food base on inactive tissues or dead tissues, it can move directly into healthy tissues, and that's what's happening here. Here it is on calceolaria, producing real neat little spots. The only good thing about this is that the nurseryman wouldn't use those plants, and so he gave me a whole carload of botrytis-infected calceolaria, and I had the most beautiful bed of calceolaria that winter that you ever saw. Hasn't happened again, so I haven't had such a beautiful bed again. Here it's gone into a chrysanthemum stem. It's moving both directions on the chrysanthemum stem. It's going to kill that stem, and that flower, of course, is going to be worthless. Here it is on Lisianthus. Flowers very, very susceptible. Some flowers are more susceptible than others. You all know Lisianthus eustoma. Beautiful plant, but susceptible to many diseases, and this is just one of them. And poinsettia bracts are very, very susceptible. If you buy a poinsettia and put it out on your porch, and if it gets rained on, it's going to look like this, and that's due to botrytis. If you want to prevent that, prevent the rain from falling on the poinsettia, and then put the plant back out again, and you won't have this problem. And there's the botrytis fungus. Absolutely fantastically beautiful. The interesting thing, this stem is flattened, and each section is at right angles to the next section. And this somehow or other creates a movement in the fungus due to a change in temperature or a change in air pressure or a change in air movement. And it causes that stem, each one of those stems, to jerk like this. And when it does, it throws some of the spores off, and then the air currents carry them around and infect. All these fungi are adapted. I tell you, we think we know a lot, but they are pretty smart.